So bringing the Revenant project on ahead, we need to start firing this thing and find out if it's any good. To do that, we need to make brass. First thing I found when I started putting it together is that the barrel that I had chose to put on here is my old original 308 Matson, and it's got the Ichabod neck. Now remember, this thing was designed by me bellying up with an RCBS resizing die and shortening it a couple hundred thousandths to make it legal for something called HBR competition. A standard HBR type cartridge looks similar to this. Some of them are 30-30, which is where the case capacity comes from. This is a more modernized version because in the years since I built this thing, I've ordered another reamer that's properly spec'd at the back and has a normal sized neck on it. But the original iteration of this thing was what I called the Ichabod, which has a very long neck. Because all I did was ground that die off and ran the shoulder down, and I ended up with a cartridge that looked like this. And it shot fine, but the problem was that using that RCBS die, it sized the neck. I figured I could, it oversized the neck, but I figured I wanted a neck turned case anyway, so that's no problem. I can play with neck tension by turning the cases to different thicknesses. Kind of backwards, but it's a way to play with neck thickness. You just make a lot of cases. By a lot, I mean not a bunch, but a lot, a group of cases. And this particular case is turned, because I started off of a die and I just drove it back about 200 thousandths, the shoulder. I then sent that die off to Dave Kiff and I had him make a reamer based on that die. And the problem was that the back end ended up so skinny because factory dies and such are so small that it hangs up and sticks in here. The back of the case was always the back of the chamber has always been too small to allow these cases to season in, and they start ticking and clicking and sticking. I shot it for a few years, it seemed to shoot okay, but two things happened. Number one, just as I was ready to enter into the competitive arena, fellow that was running, I got liver cancer and the whole venue around here died. So let me come back out here. Just a long way of saying everything languished. I couldn't fix it. Well, in the meantime, I bought another reamer that makes a proper setup. The problem is that my old sizing die didn't fit that reamer. So it's just been fight after fight after fight on this gun. Well, I decided to go back and go back old school and make myself some Ichabod cases, because something that's happened since this whole project started, the biggest hang-up at the time was I was looking for a case that was this size. This is prior to the 6.5 by 47 case, which has morphed into the 6 by 47 and all of the iterations. All we had to work with then was a 308, and there was a 308 with a small primer pocket called the basic case that they made the Carmichael Huntington Cheetah out of, but it had a big flash hole, so it didn't work. The big flash hole completely negated the cool effect of the small primer, so it was a waste of time and space. In the meantime, since I started this project, a bunch of changes in the universe have happened. Number one, the 6.5 by 47 case came out, which incidentally is what these cases are made from. Oops, that's an Ichabod, sorry. This case right here is actually head stamped 6.5 by 47 Lapua, which you can't read and I don't care. But this is small primer pocket, this is small flash hole. These things shoot like a mother. And they're a tiny bit smaller at the base, like half a thou or so smaller than the basic brass that I used to have. And so they last without clicking for a while. This case has probably been fired 20 times using the dies in the cases I set up back in the 90s. But I'm sure the last 5 or 8 times it's been fired, it clicks. Well, the clicking, the upsetting of the bags doesn't work for what it's used for. So this has been languishing on the back burner until I decided to take it up again. And another thing that has changed in that interim is I've been fiddling around with turning cases on the lathe. So I thought, well, this will be an interesting experiment because I can do a bunch of things. I can push shoulders back on new cases and make the old original 300 Ichabod 308 minus 2000. And then I can try to turn those cases on the lathe without having to fire for them because this neck is so bloody long that maybe it would work. Here I am a few days into this project and I'm finding things and remembering things about this old gun from back when I designed and built it. And overcoming the problems. Now, I didn't have a lathe back then. I didn't have all sorts of things. So when it came down to try shooting this thing, I was just stymied between the die fit and the case trimming and all this different stuff with hand tools. Well, now I've got a lathe, and I decided to take this old barrel. I torqued it on there to 60 or 80 pounds using a rear entry action wrench. Just turned it down old school. Little bitty case, very small impulse. It should hold just fine. It used to. I used to shoot it. It shot great. And most of your PPC BR size stuff, even up to 6x47 is where it starts to get ragged. This, oddly enough, is not quite as high intensity a case as the 6x47, even though it's similarly sized. Because of the bigger neck, it releases differently. I haven't fought as much with it. But those are all asides, those are all my ideas. Those may be true, may not be true. I really don't know. But I decided, you know what? Got a piece of paper here that's going to show you what my plan was. I decided to start with a regular 308 case. Because the first thing I wanted to do was proof concept, find out if it was even going to work. So I took some plain old Lapo 308 cases and I slammed them into that die, the old original die, and they were a tiny bit over long. And I got some pleats in them, which I'm going to talk about because I'm trying a different sizing move that I did back in the day. But I proved the concept. I proved with those 308 cases that yes, I can. These are Palma cases. These are huge primer pocket. These are the ones I proved the concept with. These have been slammed in. Some of them pleated a little bit in here when I slammed them in, and then they were turned on the lathe. Now the cool things about turning these on the lathe, these are tiny little case heads. I don't have to go through any of the histrionics. I actually run up with this big long neck. I slide my carriage up. I would show you this, but my lighting out there is so crappy and I've did enough lathe turning on the lathe episodes. With this case, I'm able to just slide my tailstock up, push this case onto the mandrel with an open chuck, just push it on, back the mandrel off, turn the case with it just spinning merrily in the air. Then I come back and I mandrel down, or I run the chuck down over the top of it, tighten it up, pull the case back off the mandrel. Easy, easy peasy. These are the fastest and the easiest that I've been able to do. No shell holders to dink with, no hard in and out. We're not cutting these to length. I'm cutting them to length on something else, which is easy. So all I'm doing is turning, so the setments aren't, you just go in until you hit about, I don't have a stop. I turn. Now, these turn, I'm turning these down a ton. This was back in the 262 days. All the PPCs in the world were 262s. I don't need this. I was going to draw some pictures, but I'll wait and see if I have to draw pictures. 262 necks, skinny necks, and people are constantly buying ball mics and checking, and I had this idea in my head that thickness of neck meant something. Total BS. Just stuff passed down generation to generation by stupid people that don't take the time to test stuff. So, These are thin, skinny, little, weeny little necks. You can't see them there because I'm not going to bring them up into the camera. But these are very fragile necks. I turned a lot off. You know what, I am going to bring it up in the camera because I'm going to show you some of my turnings. Some of the things that you're going to notice that I do. See how that feathers up into the shoulder? On one of the other turning videos, I show my, couple episodes ago, or before or after, I don't know when it is, I show the way I grind my tool. And the way the tool is ground, it runs or feathers up into the shoulder. So hopefully I can get this into a position. Now because I turned so much off of these dogs, I set my lathe up so that I turn a pass into the shoulder, which takes off a lot. These are the turnings going toward the shoulder and cutting that feathered edge. Then, coming back out, I go in just over a half a thou, and these little balls roll off. I just turn, it doesn't matter, turn in, big heavy monkey, turn back out, takes a tiny ball off, ends up with a really nicely turned neck. So I did that on these regular 308 cases. Then I went and made some actual good Palma cases. And now while that camera's up there, I'm going to show you what I was talking about with pleating. If I can get this in the light just right, you're going to be able to see. One of the things that I did differently here is because back in the day I used to use, there you can see the pleating. I used Imperial sizing dye lube. And I tried sizing, all kinds of sizing oils and assembly lubes. See, that one there has got some pleating on it too. Well, recently I've taken to just about always using lanolin. I go through so much crap that I look and I'm out of, you know, whatever it is that I'm using. I buy these great big bulk bins of lanolin. So this pleating was something that I hadn't experienced for many, many years, because lanolin builds thick because it's thick and gummy. This lanolin that I'm using today for this is very gummy, very thicker than honey, and thicker than most of the sizing lubes. And all of a sudden I noticed the first two that I ran through came out with little pleats on the neck, and I saved them. I set them aside. So I said, okay, there's something you could show. That was from me wiping on and wiping off with my fingers as thin as I could. Well, that's not good enough. That's too much sizing lube that causes those pleats. Instead, I dip my finger once, I put lube on about 5 cases in a row, and it starts to get down to where it's thin. Then I set those cases aside and I do about 5 more with what's left on my fingers. Then I go back, take each one of those cases and wipe it down as my fingers are drying out. In the end, one finger load has to be spread over about 15 cases. And then you get cases that are perfect. Absolutely no pleats of any sort in them. But it takes a minuscule amount of lube. When I say finger dip, I'm saying I scrape it off on the side. I'm saying I go like this, and my fingers are tacky together, but it's not pulling strings or anything. And with that one finger load, I spread that over 15 cases until I can barely feel it on all 15. Then I run them in, pop, 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 pop. And I end up with dozens of these perfect cases with no pleats. And with this long neck, it's really neat. The fact that I'm able to take this long neck and run it up on, onto the mandrel and neck turn these things with no issues, no problems, no heartaches whatsoever. So we're doing this as an old Ichabod. Now, the first thing you have to do when you're turning brass is you have to establish a fit to the end of your chamber. So I'm going to try with this phone. This is a phone sucking mother. I don't know. I tried this a minute ago in the first episode and my camera ran dry. I'm going to try to hold this. Aha, bam, there we are. Okay, so we got a nice shot of the inside here. If I can get the... There's a nice shot of the inside of the bore. Somebody else chambered this, and I noticed if I got lands and grooves varying that much, I'd have to go figure out why. But that doesn't matter. Change this around there, you can really see the variation in the lands and grooves. But here's what I wanted to show you. That right there is the end of my chamber. And right there is a case sitting back. I set one case to absolute max, and that's the one that I'm going to show you here. This case, the bolt is rammed all the way forward, and that light is inside. Hopefully it'll... And this particular bolt, this is time precision action, this particular bolt has got a feature called cam on close. I don't know if I can get this thing to turn in such a way that I can get a better reading, but if so, I could get rid of some of that reflection. By the same token, these Teslongs are crazy cool things, guys. But I came into this, I'm using an old phone, and this old phone has some problems because the battery doesn't last. So, you're going to have to live with it. You have to live with my other video too, so sorry about all that. But here's the thing, this old action, all the way up, disappears clear out of the back of the scope. And I'm not going to bring it back. Now, this is with the bolt slammed forward. I can push forward and hold it against a little... Now as I start to close the bolt, it goes down and bottoms out. And I've showed you this before, but this is hyper important when resurrecting something old or starting with a new chamber. You don't know your lengths. This particular one, that is what I call max length. That case is trimmed to length, got a very, very light chamfer, and as you notice, when I cam this thing down, it comes to 0. So I'm going to measure this case, and I'm going to call this my maximum length case, and I'm going to write it down. And this is important, because as you size, 99.99% of the times as you're sizing, your cases are growing. So this is how I establish the very first time. And I'm doing this many times so that you can look away from the camera and watch my hand and go back and forth. As this bolt cams down, now the last bit, it has no cam. All the way to the bottom, it has no cam. But it has got quite a bit of cam on close up near the top. That bottoms that out. Now this would still be safe to shoot, but once you size it and you bump that shoulder, bumping the shoulder back squeezes the neck forward like toothpaste out of a tube. The shoulder doesn't go back, the neck goes forward. So every time you size, these necks tend to grow. And if that starts to grow up and into that ramp that leads up to the lead, that ramp at the end of the chamber, that is from the OD of the neck to the ID of the neck, that's the ramp we're butting up against. Then we go into the barrel proper and the lead, which is the sloped area, the sloped cut that the nose of the bullet hits. This is, as you can see, a 0 freebore setup. Most of my reamers are set up for 0 freebore. And then I have throating reamers so that I can take them beyond that. I'm going to have to turn that off. So, to finish this up, that's Butch Lambert calling in, and he's got some steel headed my way, so I'm going to go ahead and go take that call. I just wanted to throw this in and say this is the final step of fitting brass, and that's where the Teslong bore scope is such a handy little unit to have. You can check things like that absolute scrupulous fit. And there's tools and ways that I used to do this back in the day, but this right here makes it so flippin' easy to make cases. And here when we're resurrecting the Revenant, now I'm going to be making old school cases from 25, 30 years ago, the design that I came up with 25 or 30 years ago. And it's the easiest way instead of rechambering this. Now that I have the new reamer and I have a lathe, I made it super easy on myself because I took the new reamer and I ran it into this chamber, and I didn't even have to hand cut the back of the chamber like I'd been doing on my 50s. I just ran the reamer in, widened out the back of the chamber, so now I've got the best of all worlds. I basically turned the old Ichabod case, the long-necked case, into a modern chamber by widening the back of it out. It still has the long neck, but instead of trying to cut this threads off and get further down into this shoulder and lose a little more of everything, I figured why not just use it, make some old school cases, find out where I was. Now with the new headspace, I tightened it down a little tighter than it was. All of these things come together to mean my final case iteration is going to be a tiny bit shorter than it was back in the day. So this way, the things that have changed are that I now have a Teslong so I can look in there and see it. I got all this cool stuff here that I can use to make perfectly fitted cases. And I'm just sharing that with you, and we'll move on forward, and once we get these cases made up, we'll start shooting and we'll see if I can make my new iteration of an old gun into a little round hole jobby. Enjoy the day.